no make you happy. No. Him no make you feel like I do. They both turning my way. Yeah. I can feel you warming up to me. Oh. Think I got a shot like a free throw. Ready to play the game with no cheat code. Girl, you took my heart like a repo. All these other girls not even close. Something's telling me that she knows. Oh, stuck in my mind, things I would do for you. Stuck in my mind, long night, thinking of you. Stuck in my mind. Oh my God, stuck in my mind. Oh my throat on your mind. Did not see you last week. Told me you will make it up to me. Just wanted you closer, closer. Electric feel when you brush up on me. Oh, think I got a shot like a free throw. Ready to play the game with no cheat code. Girl, you took my heart like a repo. All these other girls not even close. Something's telling me that she knows. Oh, stuck in my mind, things I would do for you. Stuck in my mind, long night, thinking of you. Stuck in my mind. Oh my God, stuck in my mind. Oh my throat on your mind. Stuck in my mind, things I would do for you. Stuck in my mind, long night, thinking of you. Stuck in my mind. Oh my God, stuck in my mind. Oh my throat on your mind. Oh my vibe on your mind. Oh my throat on your mind. Oh my vibe on your mind. Oh my throat on your mind.
But do my shima, I'ma get do my shima. I don't know put my weight in my. Say my caliber, I'm a waiting, no, pana winner. Wait it on man to sinner. Oh baby, pull up in my bima. You know promise and in a wait, oh no. Wait people, when I let go, I saw the body just take baby. I'ma you let go. I say wait people, we say we let go. I saw the body just take baby. When I be let go. Chad Malin ain't no ghostwriter. How I they give them better lamba? Pull my weight ain't no boss tiger. Oluwa too much, oh. Oluwa too much, oh. Man just they ask why you still love on me. Baba you too much, oh. Man still they ask why you too love. Who are people? When I
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome to the Movement Radio. Today's we will be doing a reading on our series, The Wonders of Books. And our topic for today will be on Tyranny by Timothy Snyder. On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, Timothy Snyder. Copyright 2017 by Timothy Snyder, all rights reserved, published in the United States by Tim Duggan Books, an imprint of the Crown Publishing Group, a division of Penguin Random House LLC, New York. In politics, being deceived is no excuse. In politics, being deceived is no excuse. Lexley Kolokonsky. Chapter 1. Do not obey in advance. Chapter 2. Defend institutions. Chapter 3. Beware the one-party state. Chapter 4. Take responsibility for the face of the world. Chapter 5. Remember professional ethics. Chapter 6. Beware, wary of paramilitaries. 7. Be reflective if you must be armed. 8. Stand out. 9. Be kind to our language. 10. Believe in the truth. 11. Investigate. 12. Make eye contact and small talk. Listen for dangerous words. 18. Be calm when the unthinkable arrives. 19. Be a patriot. 20. Be as courageous as you can. Prologue. History and Tyranny. History does not repeat, but it does instruct. As the founding fathers debated our Constitution, they took instruction from the history they knew, concerned that the democratic republic they envisioned would collapse. They contemplated the descent of ancient democracies and republics into oligarchy and empire, and they knew Aristotle warned that inequality brought instability, while Plato believed that the demagogues exploited free speech to install themselves as tyrants. In founding a democratic republic upon law and establishing a system of checks and balances, the founding fathers sought to avoid the evil that they, like the ancient philosophers, called tyranny. They had in mind the usurpation of power by a single individual or group, or the circumvention of law by rulers for their own benefit. Much of the succeeding political debate in the United States has concerned the problem of tyranny with American society over slaves and women, for example. It is thus a primary American tradition to consider history when our political order seems in peril. If we worry today that the American experiment is threatened by tyranny, we can follow the example of the founding fathers and contemplate the history of other democracies and republics. The good news is that we can draw upon more recent and relevant examples than an ancient Greece and Rome. The bad news is that the history of modern democracy is also one of decline and fall. Since the American colonies declared their independence from a British monarchy that the founders deemed tyrannical, European history has been three major democratic moments. After the First World War in 1918, after the Second World War in 1945, and after the end of the communism in 1989. Many of the democracies founded at these junctures failed in circumstances that in some important respect resemble our own. History can familiarize and it can warn. In the late 19th century, just as in the late 20th century, the expansion of global trade generated expectation of progress. In the early 20th century, as in the early 20th first, these hopes were challenged by new vision of mass politics in which a leader or a party claimed to directly represent the will of the people. European democracy collapsed into right-wing authoritarianism and fascism in the 1920s and 30s. The Communist Soviet Union, established in 1922, extended its model into Europe in the 40s. European history of 20th century shows us that societies can break, democracies can fall, ethics can collapse, and ordinary men can find themselves standing over death pit with guns in their hands. It will serve us well today to understand why. Both fascism and communism Both fascism and communism were responses to globalization, to the real and perceived inequalities it created, and the apparent helplessness of the democracies in addressing them. Fascists rejected reason in the name of will, denying objective truth in favor of a glorious myth articulated by leaders who claim to give voice to the people. They put a face on globalization, arguing that its complex challenges were the result of a conspiracy against the nations. Fascists ruled for a decade or two, leaving behind an intact intellectual legacy that grows more relevant by the day. Communists ruled for longer, for nearly 7 decades in the Soviet Union, and more than 4 decades in much of Eastern Europe. The proposed rule by a disciplined party elite with a monopoly on reason that would guide society towards a certain future according to a supposedly fixed laws of history. We might be tempted to think that our democratic heritage automatically protects us from such threats. This is a misguided reflex. In fact, the precedent set by the founders demand that we examine history to understand the deep source of tyranny and to consider the proper responses to it. Americans today are no wiser than the Europeans who saw democracy yield to fascism, Nazism, or communism in the 20th century. Our one advantage is that we might learn from their experience, and now is a good time to do so. This book presents 20 lessons from 20th century adapted to the circumstances of today. One, most of the power one, do not obey in advance. Most of the power of authoritarianism is freely given. In times like this, individuals think ahead about what a more repressive government will want and then offer themselves without being asked. A citizen who adapts in this way is teaching power what it can do. Anticipatory obedience is a political tragedy. Perhaps rulers did not initially know that citizens were willing to compromise this value or that principles. Perhaps a new regime did not at first have the direct means of influencing citizens one way or another. After the German elections of 1932, which permitted Adolf Hitler to form a government, or the Czechoslovakian election of 1946, where communists were victorious, and the next crucial step was anticipatory obedience. Because enough people in both cases voluntarily extended their services to the new leaders, Nazis and communists alike realized that they could move quickly towards a full regime change. The first heedless act of conformity could not then be reversed. In early 1938, Adolf Hitler, by then securely in power in Germany, was threatening to annex neighboring Austria. After the Austrian Chancellor conceded, it was the Austrian anticipatory obedience that decided the fate of Austrian Jews. Local Austrian Nazis captured Jews and forced them to scrub the streets to remove symbols of independent Austria. Crucially, people who were not Nazis looked on with interest and amusement. Nazis who had kept lists of Jewish properties told that what they could. Crucially, others who were not Nazis joined in the theft. As the political theorist Hannah Arendt remembered, when German troops invaded the country and Gentile neighbors started riot at Jewish homes, Austrian Jews began to commit suicide. The anticipatory obedience of Austria in March 1938 taught the high Nazi leadership what was possible. It was in Vienna that August that Adolf Eichmann escaped emigration. In November 1938, following the Austrian example of March, German Nazis organized the national pogrom known as Kristallnacht. In 1941, when Germany invaded Soviet Union, the SS took the initiative to devise the method of mass killing without orders to do so. They guessed what their superiors wanted and demonstrated what was possible. It was far more than Hitler had thought. At the very beginning, anticipatory obedience means adapting instinctively without reflecting to a new situation. At the very beginning, anticipatory obedience means adapting instinctively without reflecting to a new situation. Do only Germans do such things? The Yale psychologist Stanley Milgram, contemplating Nazis' atrocities, wanted to show that There was a particular authoritarian personality that explained why Germans behave as they had. He devised an experiment to test the proposition, but failed to get permission to carry it out in Germany. So he undertook it instead in Yale University building in 1961, at around the same time that Adolf Eichmann was being tried in Jerusalem for his part in the Nazi Holocaust of the Jews. Milgram told his subjects, some Yale students, some New Haven residents, that they would be applying an electrical shock to other participants in an experiment about learning. In fact, the people attached to the wires on the other side of a window were in on the scheme with Milgram and only pretended to be shocked. As the subjects thought they thought were participating in a learning experiment, these people whom they did not know and against whom they had no grievance seems to be suffering greatly, pounding the glass and complaining of heart pain. Even so, most subjects followed Milgram's instructions and continued to apply what they thought were ever greater shock until the victims appeared to die. Even those who did not proceed all the way to the apparent killing of their fellow human beings left without inquiring about the health of the other participants. Milgram grasps that people are remarkably receptive to new rules in a new setting. They are surprisingly willing to harm and kill others in the service of some new purpose if they are so instructed by a new authority. I found so much obedience, Milgram remembered, that I hardly saw the need for taking the experiment to Germany. 2. Defend institution. It is institution that helps us to preserve decency. They need our help as well. Do not speak of our institutions unless you make them yours by acting on their behalf. Institutions do not protect themselves, they fall after the other unless each is defended from the beginning. So choose an institution you care about: a court, a newspaper, a law, a labor union, and take its side. We tend to assume that institutions will automatically maintain themselves against even the most direct attacks. This was the very mistake that some German Jews made about Hitler and the Nazis after they had formed a government. On February 2, 1933, for example, a leading newspaper for German Jews published an editorial expressing this mislaid trust. We do not subscribe to the view that Mr. Hitler and his friends, now finally in possession of power they have so long desired, will implement the proposal circulating in Nazi newspapers. They will not suddenly deprive German Jews of their constitutional rights, nor enclose them in ghettos, nor subject them to the jealous and murderous impulse of the mob. They cannot do this because a number of crucial factors hold powers in check, and they clearly do not want to go down that road. When one acts as an European power, the whole atmosphere tends towards ethical reflection upon one's better self, away from revisiting one's earlier oppositional posture. Such was the view of many reasonable people in 1933, such as it is the view of many reasonable people now. The mistake is to assume that rulers who came to power through institutions cannot change or destroy those very institutions, even when that is exactly what they have announced that they will do. Revolutionaries sometimes do intend to destroy institutions all at once. This was the approach of the Russian Bolsheviks. Sometimes institutions are deprived of vitality and function, turned into simulacrum of what they now once were, so that they gild the new order rather than resisting it. This is what the Nazis call Gleichschaltung. It took less than a year for the new Nazi order to consolidate. By the end of 1933, Germany had become a one-party state in which all major institutions had been humbled. That November, German authorities held parliamentary elections without opposition and a referendum on an issue where the correct answer was known. To confirm the new order, some German Jews voted as Nazi leaders wanted them to, in hope that this gesture of loyalty would bind the new system to them. That was vain hope. 3. Beware the one-party state. The parties that remade states and suppressed rivals were not omnipotent from the start. They exploited a historic moment to make political life impossible for their opponents. So support the multi-party system and defend the rules of democratic elections. Vote in local and state elections while you can. Consider running for office. Thomas Jefferson probably never said that external vigilance is the price of liberty, but other Americans of his era certainly did. When we think of this saying today, we imagine our own righteous vigilance directed outward against misguided and hostile orders. We see ourselves as a city on the hill, a stronghold of democracy looking out for threats that come from abroad. But the sense of the saying was entirely different. That human nature is such that American democracy must be defended from Americans who would exploit its freedom to bring about its end. The American abolitionists, the American abolitionist, Wendell Phillips, did in fact say that external vigilance is the price of liberty. He added that the manna of popular liberty must be gathered each day, or it is rotting. The record of modern European democracies confirm the wisdom of those words. The 20th century saw earnest attempts to extend the franchise and establish durable democracies. Yet, the democracies that arose after the First World War and the Second often collapsed when a single party seized power, in some combination of an election and a coup d'etat. A party emboldened by a favorable election result or motivated by ideology or both might change the system from within. When fascists or Nazis or communists did well in election in the 30s or 40s, what followed was some combination of spectacle, repression, salami tactics, slicing off layers of opposition one by one. Most people were distracted, some were in prison, and others were outmatched. The hero of a David Lodge novel says that you don't know when you make love for the last time, that you are making love for the last time. Voting is like that. Some of the Germans who voted for the Nazi Party in 1932 no doubt understood that this might be the last meaningful free election for some time, but most did not. Some of the Czechs and Slovaks who voted for the Czechoslovakian Communist Party in 1946 probably realized that they were voting for the end of democracy, but most assumed they would have another chance. No doubt the Russians who voted in 1990 did not think that this would be the last free and fair election in their country's history, which thus far it has been. Any election can be the last, or at least the last in the lifetime of a person casting the vote. The Nazis remained in power until they lost a world war in 1945. Czechoslovakia communists until their system collapsed in 1989. The Russian oligarchy established after the 1990 election continues to function and promotes a foreign policy designed to destroy democracies elsewhere. Does this does the history of tyranny apply to the United States? Certainly, the early Americans who spoke of eternal vigilance, certainly the early Americans who spoke of eternal vigilance would have thought so. The logic of the system they devised was to mitigate the consequence of our real imperfections, not to celebrate our imaginary perfections. We certainly face, as did the ancient Greeks, the problem of oligarchy, ever more threatening as globalization increases differences in wealth. The old, the old American idea that giving money to political campaign is free speech means that the very rich have far more speech. So, in effect, far more voting power than other citizens. We believe that we have checks and balances, but have rarely faced a situation like the present, when the less popular of the two parties controls every level of power at the federal level, as well as the majority of state houses. The party that exercises such control proposes few policies that are popular with the society at large, and several that are generally unpopular, and those must either fear democracy or weaken it. Another early American proverb held that where annual elections end, tyranny begins. We will come to see one of our own election much as Russians see the elections of 1990, or the Czechs the election of 1946, or Germans the elections of 1932. This, for now, depends upon us. Much needs to be done to fix the gerrymandering system so that each citizen has one equal vote, so that each vote can be simply counted by a fellow citizen. We need paper ballots because they cannot be tampered with remotely and can always be recounted. This sort of work can be done at the local and state level. Any future elections will be a test of American tradition. So there is much to do in the meantime. 4. Take responsibility for the face of the world. The symbols of today enable the reality of tomorrow. Notice the swastika and the other signs of hate. Do not look away and do not get used to them. Remove them yourself and set an example for others to do so. Life is political not because the world cares about how you feel, but because the world reacts to what you do. The minor choices we make are themselves a kind of vote, making it more or less likely that free and fair elections will be held in the future. In the politics of the everyday, our word and gestures or their absence count very much. A few extreme and less extreme examples from the 20th century can show us how, in the Soviet Union, under the rule of Joseph Stalin, prosperous farmers were portrayed on propaganda posters as pigs, a dehumanization that is in a rural setting clearly suggests slaughter. This was in the early 30s. As the Soviet states tried to master the countryside and extract capital for crash industrialization, the peasants who had more land or livestock than others were the first to lose what they had. A neighbor, a neighbor portrayed as a pig is someone whose land you can take, but those who followed the symbolic logic became victims in their turn. Having turned the poorer peasants against the richer, its power then seized everyone's land for the new collective farms. Collectivization, when completed, brought starvation to much of the Soviet peasantry. Millions of people in Soviet Ukraine, Soviet Kazakhstan, and Soviet Russia died horrible and humiliating deaths between 1930 and 1930. Before it was over, Soviet citizens were for human needs. As the starvation in the USSR reached its height, the Nazi Party came to power in Germany. Euphoria of victory, Nazis tried to organize a boycott. This was not very successful at first, but the practice of making one wish and another as Aryan with paint on the windows or walls did affect the way Germans thought. A shop marked Jewish had no future. It became an object of contentious plan as ethnic. Envy transferred shops could be Jewish. What about other companies and properties? The wish that Jews might disappear, perhaps suppressed at first by greed. Thus, the marked shops as Jewish participated in the process by which Jews really did disappear. As did people who simply looked on markings as a natural part of the urban life, the compromise with a murderous future. You might opportunity to display symbols of loyalty. Make sure that such symbols include your fellow citizens rather than exclude. The history of lapel pins is far from innocent. In Nazi Germany in 1933, people wore lapel pins, said yes during the election, became the one-party state. In 1938, people who had not previously been Nazi began to wear swastika pins. What might be seen like a gesture of pride can be a source of exclusion. In the Europe of the 30s and 40s, some people choose to wear swastikas and then other yellow stars. The late history of communism revolution anymore offers a symbols. Even when citizens only to be left alone, public marks sustain a tyrannical regime. Czechoslovakia communists won election in 1946 and then proceeded to claim power after 1948. Czechoslovakian euphoric when the dissidents wrote the power of the powerless in 1960. It was explaining the continuity of an oppressive regime in whose goals and ideology few people still believe. Parable of a green grower who places a sign reading "Work Unite" in his shows, not that the man actually endorses the content of this quotation from the Communist Manifesto. He places the sign in his window so that he can withdraw into daily life from the authorities. Everyone else follows the same logic, with signs of loyalty and resistance becomes unthinkable. As Abel put it, we have seen that the real meaning of the green grocer slogan has nothing to do with what the text of the slogan actually says. Even so, the real meaning is quite clear and generally comprehensible. Because the code is so familiar, the green grocer declares the loyalty the only way the regime is capable of hearing. That is, by accepting the prescribed ritual, by experience as reality, by accepting the given rules of the game, thus making it possible for the game to go on, for it is to exist in the first place. What happens, asks Abel, if no one plays the game? Five, remember professional ethics. When political negative examples Professional commitment to just practice becomes more important. It is hard to subvert a rule of law state without lawyers, or to hold show trials without judges. Others need obedient civil servants. Concentration camp directors seek businessmen in cheap labor. Before the Second World War, a man named Hans Frank was Hitler's personal lawyer. After Germany invaded Poland in 1939, Frank became the Governor General of occupied Poland, the German colony where millions of Jews and other Polish citizens were murdered. He once boasted that there were not enough trees to make the paper for posters that would be needed to announce all of the executions. Frank claimed that law was meant to serve the race, so what seems good for the race was therefore the law. With argument like this, German lawyers could convince themselves that laws and rules were there to serve their project of conquest and destruction, rather than to hinder them. The man Hitler chose to oversee the annexation of Austria was a lawyer who later ran the occupation of the Netherlands. Lawyers were vastly overrepresented among the commanders of the ex-Gentgruppen, the special task force who carried out the mass murder of Jews, gypsies, Polish elites and communists, the handicapped and others. German and other physicians took part in ghastly medical experiments in the concentration camps. Businessmen from IG, Farben, and other German firms exploited the labor of concentration camps inmates. Jews in ghettos and prisoners of war, civil servants from ministers down to secretaries, oversaw and recorded it all. If lawyers had followed the norm, if lawyers had followed the norm of no execution without trial, if doctors had accepted the rules of no surgery without consent, if businessmen had endorsed the prohibition of slavery, if bureaucrats had refused to handle paperwork involving murder, then the Nazi regime would have been much harder pressed to carry out the atrocities which we remembered it for. Professions can create forms of ethical conversation that are impossible between a lonely individual and a distant government. If members of professions think of themselves as groups with common interests, with norms and rules that oblige them at all times, then they can gain confidence and indeed a certain kind of power. Professional ethics must guide us precisely when we are told that the situation is exceptional. Then there is no such thing as just following orders. If members of the profession confuse their specific ethics with the emotions of the moment, however, they can find themselves saying and doing things that they might previously have thought unimaginable. Six, be wary of paramilitaries. When the men with guns who have always claimed to be against the system start wearing uniforms and marching with torches and pictures of a leader, the end is nigh. When the pro-leader paramilitary and the official police and military intermingle, the end has come. Most governments, most of the time, seek to monopolize violence. If only the government can legitimately use force, and this use is constrained by law, then the forms of politics that we take for granted become possible. It is impossible to carry out democratic elections, try cases at courts, design and enforce laws, or indeed manage any of the other quiet business of government when agencies beyond the state also have access to violence. For just this reason, people and parties who wish to undermine democracy and the rule of law create and form violent organizations. that involve themselves in politics. Such groups can take the form of a paramilitary wing of the political party, personal bodyguard of a particular politician, or apparently spontaneous citizen initiative which usually turn out to have been organized by a party or its leaders. Armed groups first degrade a political order and then transforms it. Violent right-wing groups such as the Iron Guard in an interwar Romania or the Arrow Cross in an interwar Hungary intimidated their rivals. Nazi stormtroopers began as a security detail, clearing the halls of Hitler's opponents during his rallies. As paramilitaries known as the SA and the SS, they created a climate of fear and helped the Nazi Party in the parliamentary election of 1932 and 1933. In Austria in 1938, it was the local SA that quickly took advantage of the absence of the usual local authority to loot, beat, and humiliate Jews, thereby changing the rules of politics and preparing the way for the Nazi takeover of the country. It was the SS that ran the German concentration camps, lawless zones where ordinary rules did not apply during the Second World War. The SS extended the lawlessness it had pioneered in the camps to whole European countries under German occupation. The SS began as an organization outside the law, became an organization that transcended the law, and ended up as an organization that undid the law. Because the American federal government uses mercenaries in warfare and American state government pay corporations to run prisons and internment camps, the use of violence in the United States is already highly privatized. What was novel in 2016 was a candidate who ordered a private security detail to clear opponents from rallies and encourage the audience itself to remove people who express different opinions. The protester will first be greeted with boos, then with frantic cries of USA, and then be forced to leave the rally. At one campaign rally, the candidate said, "There is a remnant left over there. Maybe get the remnant out. Get the remnant out." The crowd, taking its cue, then tried to root out other people who might be dissenters, all the while crying USA. The candidate interjected, "Isn't this more fun than a regular booing rally? To me, it's fun." This kind of mob violence was meant to transform the political atmosphere, and it did. For violence to transform, not just the atmosphere, but also the system, the emotions of rallies and the ideology of exclusion have to be incorporated into the training of armed guards. This first challenged the police and the military, then penetrates the police and the military, and finally transform the police and the military. 7. Be reflective if you must be armed. If you carry a weapon in public service, may God bless you and keep you. But know that evils of the past involved policemen and soldiers finding themselves one day doing irregular things. Be ready to say no. Authoritarian regimes usually include a special riot police force whose task is to disperse citizens who seek. Authoritarian regimes usually include special riot police force whose task is to disperse citizens who seek to protect, and a secret state police force whose assignment include the murder of dissenters and other designated enemies. And indeed, we find forces of the latter kind deeply involved in the great atrocities of the 20th century. such as the Great Terror in the Soviet Union of 1937 to 38 and the Holocaust of European Jews perpetrated by the Nazi Germany in 1941 to 45. Yet, we make a great mistake if we imagine that the Soviet NKVD or the Nazi SS acted without support, without the assistance of regular police force and sometimes regular soldiers. They could not have killed on such a large scale. In the Great Terror in the Soviet Union, NKVD officers recorded 682,691 executions of supposed enemies of the state, most of them peasants and members of the national minority. Perhaps no organ of violence has ever been more centralized or better organized than the NKVD of those years. A small number of men carried out the next shot, which meant that certain NKVD officers had thousands of political murders on their conscience. Even so, they could not possibly have carried out this campaign without the assistance of local police forces, legal professionals, and civil servants throughout the Soviet Union. The Great Terror took place during a state of execution that required all policemen to subordinate themselves to the NKVD and its special task. The policemen were not the principal perpetrators, but they provided the indispensable manpower. When we think of the Nazi Holocaust of the Jews, we imagine Auschwitz and mechanized impersonal death. This was a convenient way for the Germans to remember the Holocaust, since they could claim that few of them had known exactly what had happened behind those grates. In fact, the Holocaust began not in the death of facilities but over shooting pits in Eastern Europe. And indeed, some of the commanders of the Erstrand grouping, the German task force that perpetrated some of the murders, were tried at Nuremberg and later in West German court. But even those trials were a kind of minimization of the scale of the crime. Not the SS commanders alone, but essentially all thousands of men who served under their command were murderers. And this was just the beginning. Every large-scale shooting action of the Holocaust, more than 33,000 of Jews murdered outside Kiev, more than 28,000 outside Riga, and on and on and on, involved the regular German police. All in all, regular policemen murdered more Jews than the Gruppen. Many of them had no special preparation for this task. They found themselves in an unknown land. They had their orders, and they did not want to look weak. In rare cases, when they refused these orders to murder Jews, policemen were not punished. Some killed from murderous conviction, but many others who killed were just afraid to stand out. Others' forces were at work beside conformism, but without the conformists, the great atrocities would have been impossible. Eight, standouts. Someone has to. It is easy to follow along. It can feel strange to do or say something different. But without the unease, there is no freedom. Remember Rosa Parks. The moment you set an example, the spell of the status quo is broken and others will follow. After the Second World War, after the Second World War, Europeans, Americans, and others created means of righteous resistance to Hitler. In the 30s, however, the dominant attitude had been accommodation and admiration. By the 40s, most Europeans had made their peace with the seemingly irresistible power of Nazi Germany. Influential Americans such as Charles Lindbergh opposed war with the Nazi under the slogan American First. It is those who were considered exceptional, eccentric, or even insane in their own time, those who did not change when the world around them did, whom we remember and admire today. Well, before the Second World War, numerous European states had abandoned democracy for some form of right-wing authoritarianism. Italy became the first fascist state in 1922 and was a militarily ally of Germany, and Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria had been drawn towards Germany by the promise of trade and territory. In March 1938, none of the great powers offered any resistance, as Germany annexed Austria. In September 1938, the great powers France, Italy, and Great Britain, then led by Neville Chamberlain, actually cooperated with the Nazi Germany in the partition of Czechoslovakia. In summer 1939, the Soviet Union allied with Nazi Germany, and the Red Army joined the Wehrmacht in the invasion of Poland. The Polish government chose to fight, activating agreements that brought Great Britain and France into the war. Germany, supplied with food and fuel by the Soviet Union, invaded and quickly occupied Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and even France in the spring of 1940. The remainder of the British Expeditionary Force was evacuated from the continent at Dunkirk in late May and early June 1940. When Winston Churchill became Prime Minister in May 1940, Great Britain was alone. The British had won no meaningful battles and had no important ally. They had entered the war to support Poland, a cause that seemed lost. Nazi Germany and its Soviet ally dominated the continent. The Soviet Union had invaded Finland in November 1939, beginning the bombing of Helsinki. Right after Churchill assumed office, the Soviet Union occupied and annexed three Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The United States had not entered the war. Adolf Hitler had no special animus towards Britain or its empire. Indeed, imagine a division of the world into spheres of interest. He expected Churchill to come to terms after the fall of France. Churchill did not. He told the French that whatever you may do, we shall fight on forever and ever and ever. In June 1940, Churchill told the British Parliament that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. The German Luftwaffe began the bombing of British cities. Hitler expected that this would force Churchill to sign an armistice, but he was mistaken. Churchill later called the air campaign a time when it was equally good to live or die. He spoke of the buoyant and imperturbate temper of Britain, which I had the honor to express. In fact, he himself helped the British to define themselves as proud people who would calmly resist evil. Other politicians would have found support in British public opinion to end the war. The Churchill instead resisted, inspired and won. The Royal Air Force, including two Polish squadrons and a number of other foreign pilots, held back the Luftwaffe. Without control of the air, even Hitler could not imagine an ambitious invasion of Great Britain. Churchill did what others had not done. Rather than concede in advance, he forced Hitler to change his plan. The essential German strategy had been to remove the West and then to invade, those betraying the Soviet Union, and colonize its western territories. In June 1941, with Britain still in the war, Germany attacked its Soviet ally. Now Berlin had to fight a two-front war, and Moscow and London were suddenly unexpected allies. In December 1941, Japan bombed the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and the United States entered the war. Now Moscow, Washington, and London formed a grand irresistible coalition together with the help of many other allies. These three great powers won the Second World War. But had Churchill not kept Britain in the war in 1940, there would have been no such war to fight. Churchill said that history would be kind to him because he intended to write it himself. Yet, in his vast histories and memoirs, he presented his own decision as self-evident and credited the British people and Britain's allies. Today, what Churchill deemed seems normal and right, but at the time he had to stand out. Of course, Great Britain was only in the war because the Polish leadership had chosen to fight in September 1939. Open Polish armed resistance was overcome that October. In 1940, the characters of the German occupation was becoming clear in Polish capital Warsaw. Teresa Preskorovac was meant to finish high school that year. Her family lost his property to the Germans and was forced to move to Warsaw and rent. Her father was arrested. One of her uncles was killed in the battle. Two of her brothers were in German prisoner of war camps. Warsaw itself had been heavily damaged by a German air campaign, which had killed about 25,000 people. Teresa, a very young woman, stood out among her friends and family in her reaction to the horror. At a time when it was natural to think only of oneself, she thought of others. In late 40s, the Germans began to establish ghettos in the part of Poland under their control. That October, the Jews of Warsaw and the surrounding region were required to move to a certain district of the city. One of Teresa's brothers has been friendly with a Jewish girl and her family before the war. Teresa now observed that people quietly allowed their Jewish friends to slip away from their lives. Without telling her family, at great risk to herself, Teresa chose to enter the Warsaw ghetto a dozen times in late 40s, bringing food, medicine to Jews she knew and Jews she did not know. By the end of the year, she had persuaded her brother's friends to escape the ghetto. In 1942, Teresa helped the girl's parents and brother to escape. That summer, in Warsaw Ghetto, the Germans carried out what they call the Great Action, deporting some 265,000 Jews to the death factory at Treblinka to be murdered, killing another 10,000 Jews in the ghetto. Teresa saved a family from certain death. Teresa Precursor later became historian of the Holocaust, writing about Warsaw Ghetto and about others who helped to aid Jews. But she preferred not to write about herself. When much later she was asked to speak about her own life, she called her actions normal. From our perspective, her actions seemed exceptional. She stood out. 9. Be kind to our language. Avoid pronouncing the phrases everyone else does. Think up your own way of speaking, even if only to convey that thing you think everyone is saying. Make an effort to separate yourself from the internet. Read books. Victor Klempera, a literary scholar of Jewish origin, turned his philosophical training against Nazi propaganda. He noticed how Hitler's language rejected legitimate opposition. The people always meant some people and not others. The president uses word in the way encounters were always struggles. The president say winning, and any attempt by free people to understand the word in a different way was defamation of the leader, or the president puts it libel. Politicians in our times feed this cliche to television, where even those who wish to disagree repeat them. Television purports to challenge political language by conveying images, but the succession from one frame to another can hinder a sense of resolution. Everything happens fast, but nothing actually happens. Each story on television news is breaking until it is displaced by the next one. So we are hit by wave upon wave, but never see the ocean. The effort to define and shape and significance of events requires words and concepts that elude us when we are entranced by visual stimuli. Watching televised news is sometimes little more than looking at someone who is also looking at a picture. We take the collective trance to be normal. We have slowly fallen into it. More than half a century ago, the classic novels of totalitarianism warned of the domination of screens, the suppressions of books, the narrowing of vocabularies, and the associated difficulty of thought. In Ray Bradbury, Fahrenheit 451, published in 1953, firemen find and burn books while most citizens watch interactive television. In George Orwell's 1984, published in 1949, books are banned and television is the two-way allowing the government to observe citizens at all times. In 1984, the language of visual media is highly constrained. To starve the public of concepts needed to think about present, remember the past, consider the future. One of the regime's projects is to limit the language further by eliminating ever more words with each edition of the official dictionary. Staring at screens is perhaps unavoidable, but the two-dimensional words makes little sense unless we can draw upon a mental armory that we have developed somewhere else. When we repeat the same words and phrases that appear in the daily media, we accept the absence of a larger framework. To have such framework requires more concepts, and having more concepts requires reading. So get the screen out of your room and surround yourselves with books. The characters in Orwell's and Bradbury book could not do this, but we still can. What to read? Any good novel enlivens our ability to think about ambiguous situations and judge the intentions of others. Frodo Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov and Milan Kundera, The Unbearable Lightness of Being Might, suit our moment. Sinclair Lewis' novel It Can't Happen. Here it's perhaps not a great book of art. Philip Roth's The Plot Against America is better. One novel known by millions of young Americans that offers an account of tyranny and resistance is J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. If you or your friends or your children did not read it that way the first time, then it bears reading again. Some of the political and historical texts that inform the argument made here are Politics and the English Language by George Orwell, 1946, The Language of the Third Reich by Victor Klemperer, 1947, Origin of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt, 1951, The Rebel by Albert Camus, 1951, The Captive Mind by Czesław Miloszewski, 1953, The Power of Powerlessness by Valka Havel, 1978, How to be a Conservative Liberal Socialist by Lindsay Kolaszki, 1978, The Uses of Adversity by Timothy Gantin Hash, 1989, The Burden of Responsibility by Tony Judd, 1998, Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning, 1992, and Nothing is True and Everything is Possible by Peter Pomerantse, 2014. Christians might return to the foundational book, which is as ever is very timely. Jesus preached that it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of God. We should be modest, for whosoever shall exalt himself shall be abased, and that he shall humble himself shall be exalted. And of course, we must concern with what is true and what is false. And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Ten, believe in truth. To abandon fact is to abandon freedom. If nothing is true, then no one can criticize power because there is no basis upon which to do so. If nothing is true, then all is spectacle. The biggest wallet pays for the most blinding lights. You submit to tyranny when you renounce the difference between what you want to hear and what is actually the case. This renunciation of reality can feel natural and pleasant, but the result is your demise as an individual, and thus the collapse of any political system that depends upon individualism. As observers of totalitarianism, such as Victor Klepera, notice, truth dies in four modes. The first mode is the open hostility to verifiable reality, which takes the form of presenting inventions and lies as if they were fact. The president does this at a high rate and at a fast pace. One attempt during the 2016 campaign to track his utterances found that 78% of his factual claims were false. This proposition is so high that it makes the correct assertion seems like unintended oversight on the path towards total fiction. Demeaning the world as it begins the creation of a fictional counterworld. The second mode is shamanistic incantations. A Klepera noted, fascist style depends upon endless repetition, designed to make fictional plausible and criminal desirable. The systemic use of nicknames such as Lying Ted and Crooked Hillary displays certain character traits that might more appropriately have been affixed to the president himself. Yet, through blunt repetition over Twitter, our president managed to transform the actions of individuals into stereotypes that people then spoke aloud. At rallies, the repeated chant of "build that wall, lock her up" did not describe anything that the president had specific plans to do, but the very grandiosity established a connection between him and his audience. The next mode is magical thinking or open embrace of contradiction. The president campaign involved the promises of cutting taxes for everyone, eliminating national debt, and increasing spending on both social policy and national defense. These promises mutually contradict, as it is if a farmer said he were taking an egg from the hen out, boiling it while and serving it to his wife, and also poaching it and serving it to his children, then returning to the hen unbroken, and then watching as the chick hatches. Accepting untruth of this radical kind requires a blatant abandonment of reason. Klemperer description of losing friends in Germany in 1993 over the issue of magical thinking ring eerily true today. One of his former students employed him to abandon yourself to your feelings. Abandon yourself to your feelings, and you must always focus on the Führer's greatness rather than on the discomfort you are feeling. Abandon yourself to your feeling, and you must always focus on the Führer's greatness rather than on the discomfort you are feeling at present. 12 years later, after all the atrocities and at the end of a war that Germany had clearly lost, an amputated soldier told Klepperer that Hitler has never lied yet. I believe in Hitler. The final mode is misplaced faith. Involves the sorts of self-defying claims that President made when he said, "I alone can solve it," or "I am your voice." When faith descends from heaven to earth in this way, no room remains for the small truth of our individual discernment and experience. What terrified Klepera was the way that his transition seems permanent. Once truth had become oracular rather than factual, evidence was irrelevant. At the end of the war, a worker told Klepera that understanding is useless. You have to have faith. I believe in Eugene Ionescu, the great Romanian playwright, watched one friend after another slipped away into the language of fascism in the 30s. The experience became the basis of his 1959 absurdist play, Rhinoceros, in which those who fall prey to propaganda are transformed into giant horned beasts of his own personal experience, Ionescu wrote. University professors, students, intellectuals were turning Nazi, becoming from guards one after the other. At the beginning, certainly they were not Nazis. After 15 of us would get together to talk and try to find arguments opposing fears, it was not easy. From time to time, one of our friends said, "I don't agree with them, to be sure, but on certain point, nevertheless, I must admit, for example, the Jews, etc." And this was a symptom 3 weeks later, this person would become a Nazi. He was caught in the mechanism. He accepted everything. He became a rhinoceros towards the end. Only 3 or 4 of us were still resisting. Lonisco aimed was to help us see just how bizarre propaganda actually is, but how it's normal it seems to those who yield to it. By using the absurd image of rhinoceros, Lonesco was trying to shock people into noticing the strangeness of what was actually happening. Rhinoceros are roaming through our neurological savannas. We now find ourselves very much concerned with something we call post-truth, and we tend to think that it's con of everyday fact, and its construction of alternative realities is something new or postmodern. Yet there is little here that George Orwell did not capture 7 decades ago in his notion of doublethink. In his philosophy, post-truth restores precisely the fascist attitude to truth, and that is why nothing in our own world, Stato Clepera or Lunesco. Fascists despise the small truth of daily existence, loved slogans that resonated like a new religion, and preferred creative myth to history or journalism. They used new media, which at the time was radio, to create a drumbeat of propaganda that arouse feelings before people had time to ascertain fact. And now, as then, many people confuse faith in a hugely flawed leader with the truth about the world we all share. Post truth is fascism.